Considering a fully remote role in tech, it sounds so fun, doesn't it? You're probably picturing a nomadic lifestyle where you hop to another city every week and drink margaritas on the beach, right? Let me stop you right there, because this video will break down the good, the bad, and the ugly of remote work, and then you get to decide if it's the right fit for you. So keep watching and subscribe to this channel for more videos for software engineers. Hi, I'm Yulia Eskin, a Silicon Valley tech lead and a career coach for software engineers. This is the Blue Angels are practicing for Fleet Week. Hi, I'm Yulia Eskin, a Silicon Valley tech lead and a career coach for software engineers. This is the right channel for you if you want to get promoted, become a tech lead, or just be a better engineer. So let's dive into the good, the bad, and the ugly. The world is buzzing with remote work opportunities for software engineers, and it's so tempting to move to Hawaii, work from the beach for a cool Silicon Valley company without the Silicon Valley prices, right? Well, before you pack your bags and head to the beach, let me get into when and for whom remote work works and for whom it doesn't, and what are the positive and negative consequences of remote work. And let me just add that what I'm going to share with you is based on my personal experience working for several years on remote teams where I was on a team in San Francisco that was co-located in an office, and we've had satellite teams in Chicago and Brazil. So I'm very familiar with having to work on big software projects when some people are remote, some people are co-located. So when does remote work? I think the first big component is having highly independent work. And so what does that mean in software engineering? So for example, if you're working on a solo project that doesn't really require any touch points with anybody else in the company on a very regular basis, then you're pretty much set. You're able to work on that with no interruptions and be productive. Another example is if you're working on a project with other people, but let's say you're the only person in a certain function. So maybe you're the only test automation engineer, or you're the only front-end engineer. You might need to get some requirements from the people in the group, but you don't have another front-end engineer that you need to talk to very frequently in order to do your job. So in these kinds of conditions, remote work really makes sense, because even if you were sitting in an office, you would still basically be doing your work on your own without needing other people around you. The other component that really makes remote work is when the people are very senior. But basically what I'll say is when you are a senior engineer, you don't need a lot of coordination, you don't need a lot of supervision or guidance. You pretty much already know what to do. And that means that you're able to be productive without needing other people. Another important piece here is senior engineers not only possess a lot of knowledge, but they also possess a lot of confidence. So if you're a senior engineer, even if you don't get a lot of validation from other people, even if you don't talk on a regular basis with colleagues, you still feel quite secure and confident that what you're doing is correct. However, it would be very different if you were a junior engineer. The other factor is when the code base and the product are already quite mature. It's a lot easier to work on a product where the majority of it has been built and you're contributing maybe small pieces, you're doing optimization, you're doing maintenance, fixing bugs, but you basically don't have a lot of need for discovery. You don't need to do a lot of problem solving and a lot of brainstorming with the team in order to move forward. And another important point is that for mature products, large architectural changes are no longer needed, and those really do require a team to come together. And I want to touch a little bit about the team. If you're coming into a team that already has a lot of level of trust, they're really bonded, they work well together, then it's a lot easier for remote work to work. Actually, any team that meshes well will be more productive. But in a remote setting, it's even more important if you're working on a team. Having a high level of trust, coordination, and productivity is super important. And a team that meshed well means they've already figured out a lot of kinks in their process, in their communication, in their code review. So they're basically like a good oiled machine at this point. So if you're getting hired and entering a team like that, it's a lot easier for you to succeed because the groundwork for success has already been done on this team. And the last two factors are really dependent on the management. If you're working for a large enough company and team, then management has a really critical role to play. If they're very clear on requirements, on prioritization, and what your work as an individual contributor should be, then they're basically doing everything behind the scenes so that you are able to focus just on your work. Another important aspect here is that the management really needs to focus on helping the team continue to build trust. And it will keep coming back to trust because it is the currency for a team's efficiency and productivity. So as new remote members are coming to the team needs to reestablish trust as a new group. This is where management really needs to create those opportunities for bonding, for social time together, for off hours, fun activities, so that people get to know each other more informally and more as people. That will then translate to a lot more cohesion and trust in each other when you have to collaborate on a technical project. So let's now talk about when does remote work not work. From my experience working at startups, I can see that remote work is going to be very difficult to translate there. And this is because of these factors. So a challenging environment for remote work to succeed is in highly innovative companies. And examples of that are usually startups or maybe a smaller unit in a bigger company that does a lot of research and development. And let me explain. Startups often work on greenfield projects. Greenfield projects are basically projects that are completely new. You start something from scratch. You don't depend on legacy code. You don't have a model of how to build it. When you're building something like that, which is what most startups do, you need to do a lot of discovery, a lot of iteration, and a lot of brainstorming as a group. And it's very, very hard to have that level of communication when everybody is remote. Because there's something that happens when people get together in a room, when they whiteboard solutions, when they get inspired by an idea that somebody just proposed. It's quite hard to create this environment in a remote setting. The other super important factor I want you to pay attention to is it does not work well for junior engineers. And I'll repeat this because it's very, very important. It does not work well for junior engineers. Junior engineers are engineers that are in their first 2 to 3 years of their career. At that point, this is where most of the learning happens. This is where they need a lot of supervision. They need to be around people so that they absorb knowledge, so that they see different technical approaches, so that you can tap a coworker on the shoulder and just ask a random question about your work or about architecture, about anything. Junior engineers really, really benefit from being that fly on the wall in a room of experts. This is when they're exposed to a lot of ideas they've never heard before. This is where they start developing trust in their own ideas because their ideas get validated. And it's a lot harder for this to happen in a remote work setting because that kind of setting makes all interactions a lot more formal. In order to learn from people, in order to ask a question, you have to set up a meeting with somebody. You have to interrupt someone. It's a lot easier and informal thing to do when you are just around people. Another thing that happens in the physical office is that junior engineers basically develop a lot of trust for the people that they work with. And that is harder to do in a remote setting because there are less opportunities for informal interactions. As a junior engineer, you really need to hear that your ideas are sound and feel validated, and for somebody to give you a tip here and there. And if you're a remote junior engineer working with other junior engineers, then basically you don't even have a lot of people to learn from. Having senior people around you, and this is just in general, remote work or not remote work, is a very important step to growing yourself. The other aspect that makes this more challenging is when management is either non-existent, so there isn't a clear leader, or there's just not enough managers for all of the engineers. And that means that nobody is really taking care of communicating, coordinating, and setting priorities. And lastly, if you're working at a company where you're building something that really has a lot of dependencies on other people, on other teams, and a lot of approval that you need to get, your hands really become stuck, and it's very hard to make progress yourself without that process being very efficient. In a remote work setting, these kind of things usually take more time to happen, which means that you're just going to be waiting around a lot. So if you're just starting out as a junior engineer and you want to do really well in your first year in tech, please check out my website and how I can support you as a career coach as you navigate tech for the first time. So now I really want to talk about what are the consequences of remote work, both the positive and negative. So to start off, I think the biggest benefit of remote work is that the world becomes your oyster, both for companies and for individuals. As a job seeker, you now have access to a much larger job market. And as a company, you are not constrained anymore with your geography. And let's say as Silicon Valley companies would have to pay Silicon Valley salaries for people here. Now you have the option of living in a much cheaper place and working for the same company. I think there's a really big societal benefit, which means that you have a level playing field and more of merit-based hiring that does not depend on your geographic location. If you're a good engineer, if you're talented, and if you have the right work experience, you can get hired by top companies in the world without sacrificing moving to another place that you won't necessarily want to move to. So basically, the main benefit here is a bigger talent pool, more diversity, and more merit-based hiring. The other aspect in which remote work is excellent is flexibility. You have flexibility of how to design your workday. I think this is really interesting because now we're starting to tap into our natural productivity. Instead of a 9-to-5 workday, some people are night owls and some people are morning people. Maybe for you it would be great to work from 7 to 3, and for me I would much rather work from 11 to 7. It really allows for us to design our day as individuals. And I really like that remote work helps us personalize our own work experience. I would also want to mention that the flexibility aspect is so important for people who are caregivers or parents. Sadly, parents do get discriminated sometimes in the workforce, especially mothers, because maybe they're not able to be as available as other employees. Maybe they have to leave early to pick up their children. And this creates an environment where there's the perception problem that somebody is a lot more available than the mother who has 2 little kids. I think remote work really normalizes the fact that flexibility is important to people and gives opportunities for those who used to miss out on a lot of promotions and growth to get that power back. And the other big, very obvious benefit of remote work is that it's location agnostic, which means that you can pretty much move anywhere within the time zone or several time zones of your employer. Due to remote work being location agnostic, I think you're gaining a lot more control on your financial freedom, on your financial spending. You can decide where is the best place for you to live, to buy a house, to start a family, while enjoying interesting and stimulating work, but that you would never have had access in your city. And lastly, the location agnostic aspect I think brings out a very important thing about work-life balance, about creating the lifestyle that you want to have, that beforehand would be impossible. I think remote work starts to really blur the lines between work and pleasure, and that is huge. That again gives back the power to you to design your own life. You can live in the beach in Hawaii, you can live in the mountains in a cabin far away from people, or you can live in a bustling city like New York. But it's really up to you, it's in your own hands. And that is the thing that excites me so much about remote work, is the level of control that you have in designing your own life. And the last and probably the most positive aspect of remote work is that it actually increases productivity. So if you do have the kind of job in which remote work really excels, then you're probably a lot more productive being at home than you would be working in an office where there's a lot more interruptions, informal conversations, meetings, and so forth. So what are the negative consequences of remote work? One consequence that I feel very strongly about is that it does hurt innovation. And maybe you disagree with me, but from my experience with working in a large team that was distributed in the world, it is a lot slower, it is a lot harder to communicate requirements, to do problem solving, to brainstorm when people are not all together. And I think we have to admit that it does slow down innovation. Maybe that's not a bad thing for a certain company, but it's definitely very negative if you are a startup that's trying to build as fast as possible with the funding that you have. Remote work is also really horrible for mentorship and for spreading tribal knowledge, especially for junior engineers. Now, what is tribal knowledge? Tribal knowledge is a term that's used a lot in smaller companies like startups when there's still not a lot of documentation and all the know-how lives basically in people's heads. And it's something that you learn just through exposure, just through seeing people talk about it, just through calling somebody to help you out. It's really much harder to learn all of that, especially when you're a junior engineer, where you have a barrier to asking questions, where everything becomes really official. And at the same time, you're not getting a lot of that informal mentorship and validation for your ideas that you would get when you're sitting with people and brainstorming solutions and approaches. Another negative aspect here is that trust between the team starts to wear off as people work remotely, even if they did work together physically before. And as I mentioned, trust is a really, really important component of efficient and productive teams. So in order to rebuild trust, you really need to have management that thinks about it and puts a lot of effort into it. Because without trust, it really hurts people's ability to speak up, to start brainstorming, to share new ideas, and to collaborate with others. And this leads me to my next point, which is in the remote environment, environment, it's a lot harder to read people's body language. And this isn't the case where people are actually turning their cameras on, which I've seen that right now a lot of people don't do it anymore in meetings. You might even be talking in the meeting to this point and you don't see people's body language, and you have a hard time assessing whether they understood what you said, whether they like your idea or not. It just becomes very hard to gather a lot of this nonverbal feedback that we get from people's body language. And again, without that, trust goes down. And basically the consequence of all of that is that it leads employees to feel more isolated and unmotivated, which is not a great thing to have in your company's workforce, because it means people take less initiative, there's less of a cohesive culture on the team, and eventually productivity goes down as well. And the last thing I want to touch on here is that it's a lot harder to build a culture in a remote team where people feel included, where people feel seen, and where people feel passionate about what they're doing. From a company standpoint, that's not great, because a company puts a lot of resources into training people, and eventually they do expect a certain level of loyalty from employees. If you don't feel a lot of connection to the company you're working with, then everything becomes really replaceable, and you could just switch this company for another company. And of course, that is not very attractive for companies, and why I think some companies are afraid to introduce remote work. So I hope that this video shed some light on the good, the bad, and the ugly of remote work and gave you a lot to think about. What are your thoughts? Which environment do you think that you would be more happy in and more productive in? So if this video was helpful for you, please like and subscribe to my channel. And if you're a junior engineer who's just entering tech for the first time, please take a look at my website and the different career coaching packages that I have in order to support you in your first few years in tech. Bye, and see you in the next video.